Good morning, Grid Connections listeners, and welcome back to Season 6 of Grid Connections, the podcast where we explore all things transportation, clean energy, and our power grid, connecting all these systems together. This season, we are actually upping the ante, and we'll be trying our best to bring you not one, but actually 2 new episodes per week. We'll be covering more topics and highlighting how all of the technologies we discuss here work together. It seems like these technologies are advancing ever faster each week, and that's why we're excited to be increasing how many episodes we're bringing to you, our listeners. We're excited for some of the great guests and panels we already have lined up for this season. But please let us know who you want to hear from, or even if you have just an idea for an episode, please reach out to us either on social channels, our website, gridconnections.fm, or email us at guests@gridconnections.fm. Today, we welcome back returning guest Loren McDonald, the Chief Analyst at Paren. We dive headfirst into the latest developments of National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, as most of our listeners are probably most familiar with it, including how recent federal decisions and policy shifts are affecting which charging projects move forward and which are hitting pause. You'll hear Loren's insider view on how some states are proceeding full throttle while others are pumping the brakes, and why this impacts everyone from road trip warriors to rideshare drivers. Plus, we touch on evolving federal influence over EV charging, who actually holds the power to pause NEVI funds, and what can still move ahead despite ongoing changes. Key takeaways for charging deserts, how a delayed rollout may impact the most rural states and areas that need infrastructure the most. Plus, trends in public charging, from the rise in EV adoption by rideshare drivers to how data can unlock better site selection, amenities, and overall charging reliability. Whether you're an industry pro, an EV enthusiast, or just curious about the ever-changing world of electric mobility, this episode has something for you, but don't keep the conversation to yourself. Send this episode to at least one other person who would find it useful as well. And if you're enjoying Grid Connections, please take a moment to leave a positive review on our podcast page. It really helps make a difference. Your feedback also helps us to bring you expert voices like Loren McDonald's every week. With that, enjoy. Loren, thank you so much for coming on today. I know you've been doing quite the blitz of media interviews lately.
No, thanks for having me on, Chase. It's always a lot of fun to be on your webcast, and we'll probably just dive right in. But we were chatting about this before we jumped on live that I'm a bit fried from literally 20 media interviews in the last 10 days, and
Wow.
Everything from Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, CNBC Business, AP, down to I did a, local Denver, Colorado TV news station and everything in between. And it's just not stopping, right? So there's just, before we went live, so there was some breaking news, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. But yeah, it's just, it's for me, it's second only to when Tesla laid off the 500-person supercharger team as to the number of media requests and interviews I've done. It's just sort of crazy. So, some people like to say, it's like, yeah, Loren, thank Trump and Musk for all the attention.
I was going to say, better to be busy than bored. And I think, what are we on? Only week 3, or we've gone into week 4 officially. So
Yeah,
you've got
who
I think, what
knows?
is another 200 or so more to go. But
Yeah,
it's always great to have you on. We've had you on now for quite a few episodes, and we've got
yeah,
another panel coming up with you and the other guys on. But
yeah.
just in case anyone listening isn't familiar with Paren and what your team's doing, which I think is just so fascinating, and it's just covering the space so well, can you just share a little bit
Yeah,
about that realm, and
yeah,
then we'll
yeah.
get into it.
So Paren is a San Francisco-based startup. We're a EV charging data and analysis firm. I also just hold over my business EV adoption, which was acquired back in September, and I joined at the same time as chief analyst. But really, what we're doing is we're tracking all things EV charging with a specific focus right now around fast charging. So we're tracking everything from just what is all the charging infrastructure out there, the number of stations and ports and hardware and growth by state, by network, et cetera. But really what we're about is is helping companies understand really two things. One is where they probably want to locate new chargers. So we track utilization, session data, reliability data all around. Right now, more than 37,000 fast chargers in the US, and headed towards more of them, but and Canada soon. And then secondly, we have a lot of customers, everything from the charging networks and CPOs to the automakers and investors and other companies, to help them understand kind of competitive benchmark stuff. So think about your charging network, and you've got a location in downtown Atlanta or whatever it is, and you want to understand, like, are we underperforming? Are we, basically doing as well as, the neighboring EV charging networks, or we're outperforming them? And so, that's really sort of
Well,
our
competitive
core.
intelligence too.
Yeah, help them understand, is like, oh, do we have an 18% utilization rate at our station, and a mile away competitor has a 24%? Like, what are we doing wrong? Like, helping them understand that. And long term, and then we can move on to the core topic is of the day, is we're really going to pipe our data into the in-car navigation of EVs in the future. And so if you're driving down the highway and know you're going to have to stop in an hour or two or whatever it is to charge, we'll tell you basically which charging stations you should go to based on safety, lighting, price, availability, power levels. Is it working or not? Is there spaces available? And is there a Chipotle next to it versus a McDonald's in the other one? And not to pick on any quick service restaurants, but maybe you prefer Chipotle over McDonald's. And the combination of all those factors tells you to go to charging station A instead of charging station C. So that's the long-term vision, and we're getting a lot of traction towards that, and a lot of excitement and interest. But right now, we're just more of kind of a B2B data company, providing all this kind of data to companies in the industry.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that overview because obviously what you're talking about right now has such a large impact for what we're going to be talking about today. And I think the future of what you shared, and also I guess just to call it out, we had Bill Farrow on previously, your CTO at Paren.
Yeah.
And he actually also just had a great interview with Tom Malogny. I was even watching a little bit earlier today just to kind of recap and get some of his thoughts on this before today's call. But I think it's really cool just to see. I mean, that is really what does unlock a big part of the experience to make going to electric vehicles and charging and road tripping and these things that we hear that's such a problem actually become a much smoother and more, in my own personal experience, a better experience when road tripping, to know where and when you're going to charge instead of over a gas station that you kind of just pull over whenever. And being able to be more proactive about where you choose to charge, and as opposed to kind of having to figure out on the fly, or even, like I said, I think it's now a better experience having that kind of knowledge when you're able to see which chargers are available, which aren't, when going down the road, than without having that information. It just makes EVs in general so much more approachable. But
yeah, and there's some fascinating things going on, right? Is you just do you think about a charging station at different times of the day? So 1 o'clock in the afternoon versus 11 p.m. at night. So a station that you stop at 1 o'clock in the afternoon might be great and wonderful. There's a restaurant next door, and it's it's a lot of open space. There's a little park next to it. You can walk poop the dog, the kids can play, all that kind of stuff. 11 o'clock at night, there might not be any lighting. The restaurant might be closed.
Yeah.
So there's no restrooms. You don't feel safe, right? So literally, that's the type of thing we're going to bring in, is looking at literally different times of the day like a station could be highly rated at, in the
Between 8
afternoon.
a.m. to 10 p.m., it could be a great resource. And I think we've had conversations about this before. I'm probably in the kind of upper echelon of crazy EV road trippers, but yeah, there'll be times where I'm driving at midnight, 1 or 2 in the morning, as part of like trying to get that final stretch in for the day. And you're right. Like after 11 p.m., it either turns from what would be a great spot to incredibly sketchy, or at the very least, somewhere that has like a reliable bathroom.
No humans around. Yeah,
Yeah.
the restaurants are not open. There's no restrooms. There's no
Yeah.
Wi-Fi. There's like no people. It's unsafe, etc. And then the other thing, and then we'll move on, is that's really kind of fascinating. Is I think I think we've talked about this in the past that in the last year or so, one of the single biggest trends in the fast charging industry has been the adoption of EVs by rideshare drivers. And
Yeah.
Uber and Lyft are really pushing it. They're incentivizing their drivers. There's a lot of programs, and EVgo, which one of the great things about EVgo being publicly traded is every quarter they share a lot of like really great metrics about their business. And one of the things that was in their investor deck was that 25% of their throughput in Q4, right? Yeah, Q4 was from rideshare drivers. Think about that.
Wow.
1/4 of the electricity that they sold, basically, assuming that they charged for all of that. Some of it is like through free programs and stuff, but 25% of the power dispensed was to rideshare drivers. That's crazy, right? And my prediction is in 18 months to 2 years, I mean, that could be 35% heading towards
Oh,
40%
easily.
or whatever, and obviously it's a lot higher in like urban markets, like, downtown Chicago,
Easily. And once again, this also comes
you know,
into what we're talking about time of day.
yeah,
I know we've had this conversation, I believe, before, but something we've talked about quite a bit on the podcast is just around you will, especially in like urban centers, you'll roll up to one of these charging locations. There'll be a pretty big line, and it is partially because of sometimes the rideshare. Some of it's
yeah,
obviously you can kind of get the impacts of weather, but right from 8 p.m. to 8:01 p.m., maybe it drops from 32 cents to 10 cents. I actually had this happen to me. I was charging at a location. I was on the phone with my wife, and I was literally the only one at the charger.
right,
It turned 8:02, and then three EVs come around the corner. I almost think it's like some sort of car group, and
right.
within 4 minutes, I think it was at least a 12 stall. It may have been a 16 stall. It went from me being the only person to being it completely packed, and it was clear. I mean, they were really nice, but they were clearly just doing. They mostly were rideshare drivers,
Yeah, yeah,
and kind of the need for having what you see in traditional fueling, where you have commercial fueling locations, and maybe making it so Uber and others have kind of the private things that those drivers go there, and then for public use, it's not always crammed
yeah.
with drivers going at these certain times to get the lower rates.
Yeah, yeah, and then I guess one final thing on sort of the whole rideshare thing is, the fascinating thing that I just sort of share with people when I talk about this, sort of anecdotally. I'm sure like you, when you take, Uber and Lyft, and it's an electric, it's an EV, you ask them questions and stuff, and so I was asking them about, where do they live, in an apartment, a condo? Do they charge at home? Where do they charge? How often? All that kind of stuff. And the typical answers I'm getting is that, many of these drivers, the ones who are like sort of, professionals, in other words, like this is their primary source of income. They're not like teachers who do this, a couple of days a week at night or weekends. Um, some of them are charging 2 to 3 times a day,
Oh, easily.
six days
Yeah.
a week at fast charging stations, right?
I,
And my wife and I are not like you. We don't do a lot of road trips, right? So we might only use, public fast chargers a couple times a year,
Totally.
right? Right.
I
Then the
mean, that's
rest
how
of
it's
the
for
time,
most people. Yeah.
the rest of the time we're charging. So you think about, if you're, EVgo, Electrify America, Tesla, whomever, fill in Francis Energy, fill in BP, fill in the blank. Um, and the majority of their drivers are charging at their locations a couple of times a year. And then you have this like, 5% group or whatever it is that are charging potentially
Like
50
80% of
times a
it, maybe
month.
at some location. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, right. So, and that's why you have companies like Revel out of New York that are focused now just on building charging stations to support rideshare drivers, right? So yeah, it's been a really fascinating and almost overnight switch in the industry, and it's helping drive utilization and profitability. EVgo thinks that they're going to be break even later this year and stuff, and they probably will be. And a lot of that is going to be primarily because of a few urban locations used by rideshare drivers.
Well, I don't know if I told you this. I think I did, but last time I flew in the Bay Area, I get out of the airport and I use I think it was like Uber Green or whatever they call it. So
Right.
you can choose the EV. I get in the EV and we haven't even left the airport. And the guy asked me like, "Hey, can I charge?" And I was like, and it was with a little bit of a broken English accent, I'll admit. So I
Right.
thought he was like saying how when you get into a lot of Ubers, you can charge. And so I was kind of like, what? And I looked over at the screen and it showed the projected energy rate of getting to the hotel I was staying at as 2%.
Yikes.
And I realized, no, he's literally asking me if on
Yeah.
this trip from the airport, can we charge? And honestly, just fortunately, I wasn't in a rush anyway, but I was just like, okay, I'm just really curious to see how this experience is. So I say yes. And we stop at a charger right next to the airport for like 5 minutes. He smokes a quick cigarette outside
Yeah.
and then gets back, and then we drive to this. And I was just like, one, as a rider, this was such a bizarre, unexpected. And as someone just in the industry, I was like, oh, I want to see where this goes, what this kind of experience is.
Yeah.
But yeah, for so many other people, and just as someone who's trying to do this, it really does make it really hard to kind of sometimes do it in between trips. And I don't know. There's clearly this is clearly where the industry is going, which is good. But there's clearly some of these logistic things, a little fine tuning that still needs to be figured out.
And so there's the one you talked about, which is just ultimately the rideshare industry probably needs to step up to the plate and build dedicated charging stations. And the most common, location use case is going to be near airports and stuff.
Yeah.
Why they're queuing, waiting for their rides, they can plug in. Future, it's going to be wireless. They just pull over as they're queuing up, in line,
Right.
like taxi cabs and stuff. But and that ride experience, but and then the impact on the non-rideshare drivers, right? If it starts to get to a point where you go to an 8-port charging location and 7 of them are being used by rideshare drivers,
Yeah.
people are not going to be happy. But
No,
but
totally.
anyway, yeah, maybe we can do a session in the future entirely on that. Yeah.
I think the next time we have the panel together, we'll have to talk about that, because I'm sure Matt and John also have some fun takes
They'll
on
have
it.
some opinions. Yeah.
So let's get into the topic of the week, or should I say, I guess, topics of the week. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where do you want to start with NEVI and just the state of EV charging?
Let's start with NEVI, because I think that'll take up pretty much the entire show. Now that we've already wasted, or not wasted, excuse me. now that we've already
shared a few anecdotes.
Yeah. So let's start with NEVI, and as most of your listeners, presumably know by NEVI stands for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. It was part of the IIJA, which means it was a law passed by Congress, and there's a specific reason I mentioned that. And so over the last couple of weeks, the Trump administration first issued an executive order that specifically called out various programs, including charging programs and the NEVI program, and basically pausing it or attempting to pause it. And then a week later, and I don't even remember what day it is now. I think it was either, I think it was Tuesday or late last week. I can't even remember. I'm so fried. The Federal Highway Administration issued a memo, also basically saying that they are pausing the NEVI program, and that's where it gets really complicated and confusing. So, Sean Duffy, who is the new Secretary of the Department of Transportation, was it was last Thursday. Now it's all coming back to me. Was on Fox Business News on Friday, and it was a really insightful interview, because he actually explained part of it very clearly, that yes, he and FHWA/DOT cannot stop, rescind, claw back, stop funding, etc. In NEVI. Only Congress can do that because it's a law, right? So, there was a lot of confusion. Everybody's out there saying no,
Right.
Trump can't do it if he did, and he supported that. He's very clear that yes, this is a law. Only Congress can change it. However, a lot of the states posted, on their websites due to the executive order, we're pausing, blah, blah, blah. And then the memo came out and they added that sort of thing. And so they're all sort of confused. But the thing that FHWA and Duffy can do is actually revise the rules of the actual execution of the NEVI program. So to step back
Yeah,
and
that's a huge call out too.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So
exactly.
to step back and make that clear is that only Congress, can basically say we're pulling back the, it's actually not 5 billion. It's about 5.12 billion that's going to the states because there's money for the joint office, and some other programs and stuff. So it's under 4.2 billion that's actually going out over 4 years, or excuse me, over 5 fiscal years to the states. So only Congress can say, nope, we're
Yeah.
pulling that back, But back in 2021, so I think it was December of 2021, IAJ was passed. So NEVI basically became part of the law. But it wasn't until February 28th, I believe it was, the last day of February in 2023, when the final NEVI rules and requirements were basically published, right? So I like to say, there's like BCAD, like whatever it is that, this would be, I guess, the AD, I don't know, is that, NEVI really didn't start until, let's say, March 1st of 2023, because even though NEVI was programs out there and states were starting to do things, they actually didn't know what the final rules and requires. They had like a template. They knew it was probably going to be things like every 50 miles and forward 50 kW, but they didn't know is NACS going to be required. Like they
Right. There
didn't.
was even, yeah, there's so much change is still happening in the
Yeah,
industry and
and so
specific to it. Yeah.
what are you're gonna have to have credit card readers? No, you only have to have contactless payment. Like all of the minutia detail. In fact, sort of a funny anecdote is Ohio was the very first state to actually issue a NEVI RFP, and they did so in late 2022. I think it was October or November. I used to be able to remember all of the stuff in my head, but I can't anymore. And so what happened was then the rules came out, and the final rules came out in late February that had some differences of what they were assuming and had in their RFP. And so they required all the companies who had submitted RFPs to resubmit them. And I had one client who submitted 20 separate site location applications, and
Oh.
just one is a lot of work, right? Uh,
Yeah.
they were not happy. They had to resubmit all 20. But at any rate, so that sort of was when the program really started. But the point of that is what can happen, and what is being paused right now by Duffy and FHWA is in essence those rules and requirements, and so there's in essence a 90-day pause. They're going to look and review of that those rules and requirements of the program, and potentially and supposedly they're seeking input from the industry, and will come out and issue new guidance, if you will. And so what's happened, and then we'll come back to what could be some of those changes. What's happened is the states are basically pulling their hair out. They're confused. They're nervous. They're not sure what to do, et cetera. They're getting conflicting advice. They're interpreting it differently. I've talked to some of my customers who are companies that are applicants and that are actually negotiating contracts with several states. And what one customer told me was that they're seeing a red state, blue state divide. So uh, many of the blue states are basically saying the NEVI program is not paused. It can't be paused, right? And it was very clear. Duffy made it very clear on the Fox Business News interview that if there is a contract in place, we're not stopping that, right? Like
Right.
it's a legal contract between the state and the applicant, and so you can move forward. So sites that are under construction, sites that haven't even started, but there's a contract between the state, it's approved, everything, those can all move forward. And so,
Do you
yeah, go ahead.
know what roughly that number is?
So let's actually step back
Okay.
and sort of, 1,000 sites have been awarded.
And that's not ports. That is the actual stations that can have
That's the
four or more.
station,
Just to
the
clarify. Yeah.
station number. Yeah. And so if you want to do ports, I don't have that
No, no,
number.
no. That's fine.
Right.
I
Well,
just wanted
actually,
to.
I do. It's
Oh,
right
okay. Of
here.
course you do.
I did a printout in case you asked. 4,825
Wow.
ports. So basically, what we're seeing is the minimum is 4, but we've been averaging about 4.5. Actually, many of the applicants will do 6 or 8. Sometimes Tesla does 12. Interestingly enough, we're really getting into the weeds here, but sometimes Tesla will submit an application for a supercharger station that has 12 ports, but they only are requesting NEVI funding for 7.
Hmm.
But by and large, we're seeing that in most of the applications and the winning applications are for 4, but in
It
a
can
state
vary.
that has a couple of dozen applications and stuff, if 3 or 4 or 5 sites have 6, 8, 12, whatever it is, it sort of increases that average to
Yeah.
about 4.5. But yeah, so we're at 1,000 sites have been awarded across 37 states, right? Actually, just get it. Yeah. Yes, just across 37 states. And that's everything from like Rhode Island with 2
Yeah.
to I think
Well,
90
isn't
something.
the fun fact with Rhode Island, they have 2, but they're now going on to phase 2 and they're the first
Yeah.
of it just
Yeah.
because
Yeah. So we'll bounce around.
physically they're.
We'll
Yeah, and
bounce.
I don't mean to jump around too much or
Yeah.
interrupt you, but it's just kind of a funny thing to call out.
Yeah.
Because of the
Yeah.
size of it, they're the only one that's actually been able to put the full allotment in.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. So Rhode Island, if people know Rhode Island or driven through, it's basically Interstate 90 that goes up. And the interesting thing about Rhode Island is not just that they only had 2 what we call AFC sites, alternative fuel corridor sites that they had to build out according to the NEVI requirements. They are owned by the state of Rhode Island. They were 2 existing sites, park and ride sites, each with 2 charge point DC fast chargers. And so what they did was they basically added 2 more
I didn't realize that.
chargers.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So they added 2 more charge point chargers to each of those 2 sites, became NEVI compliant,
Yeah.
and were then certified. So as you said, they became the first state who was certified by the FDA that they had their corridor build out. But all they had to do, they only had 2 sites. They upgraded it, and because they were owned by the Rhode Island Department of Transportation as park and ride sites, like it was sort of easy for them to like
Yeah, get
manage the
moved
whole
forward.
process and stuff
Yeah.
like that. But anyway, so 1,000 sites have been awarded. Um, And this is where it gets a bit squishy, and this is the number one sort of question I've been getting from reporters over the last week or so is how many are under contract. And, what I've been telling people is my best guess is probably anywhere between 750 to sort of 850, of those are likely under contract between the states and the applicant. And I say that because what I've been seeing is based on open records requests that I've been filing over the last couple of years, that while it can vary from anywhere from a month to a year for a state to execute a contract, there's one client who was telling me a couple of days ago that he's still in red lines a year later with one state, right? And the 1 month and the 1 year is outliers, right? Like that's the fastest
There,
and that's
that's
the
a good point.
slowest. But even that my client told me that 3 to 4 months was a good rule. So he sort of confirmed what I figured out. And so when I filtered in our database where we track the NEVI awards, I went back to like the end of September. I used basically prior to October 1st, and that was like 782 site awards. And so that's kind of how I've come to that number, assuming that it takes 3 or 4 months to be safe. If you go back before that, yeah, it could be, like I said, it could be anywhere from probably a low of 750 to a high of 900 or somewhere in there. But, yeah, but it potentially could be less. I mean, I'm hearing that, some of the states actually, still didn't get approval on some of those sites from FHWA. So there's like two levels of approval. Um, but my theory and assumption is that probably 3/4 of the sites have executed contracts, and so they are safe, right? In other words, according to what Duffy said and what we know and understand is those sites cannot be stopped. They can proceed. Now, hopefully that's relatively clear to people.
That
Now
catches, I think, us up to where it is right now.
yeah, but
And
now
that's a lot that's happened really within just the last few weeks.
yeah, and things literally changing, kind of by the day, or you talk to different people, hear different things, and as I'm sort of still, I got 2 emails from customers this morning telling me what's happening with their negotiations, and it was actually pretty disheartening of what's happening. But that's I started to talk about it. But so what's happening now is, as I mentioned, is the state DOT, and it's not all DOT. A lot of the states actually, it's their departments of energy that actually are running and executing the NEVI program. Several states, basically, what they did is they do like an internal agreement and say, okay, Department of Energy, you handle this. You actually know electricity better than we do. We
Right.
know how to build roads and bridges, so in California example, it's the California Energy Commission. They actually had to pass not a law, but a vote in a board had to vote DOT giving permission to the CEC to run it. Maine is the same thing. It's actually the Maine Department, I forget what it's called, Maine Energy Efficiency. Rhode Island, it's the Rhode Island DOE department in combination with the DOT. Colorado is the same. It's the Colorado, so at any rate, um, what's happening and what one customer told me was that he's seeing this sort of red state, blue state divide. So in the contract negotiations and conversations that they're having with either the DOE or DOT in blue states is most of them are saying, we're moving forward. We're not stopping. Like it's very clear. We, we do not have to pause. We do not have to stop. The rules and the laws are in our favor. This can't be stopped. We've got contracts. We're moving forward, right? Whereas a lot of the red states are going, whoa, this is paused. We're told can't do anything, so we're going to be safe and conservative. And you don't know if it's people down in the corner office or in the Capitol, or necessarily the attorney's general office. That's always a hard one to remember where to put the S. Um, who's telling them. But yeah, we're seeing this sort of divide where literally states, next to each other or whatever, are interpreting this differently, and some are just pausing. They're saying we're not doing anything. And there's also kind of a third group. I won't name names of states because some of it is not public, but there's one very what I'll call best practice state that was out there very early and doing quite well. That is in a round of in one of their non-first rounds. They're in one of their later rounds. And they're continuing to score applications. So it was opened, then closed, the round of RFPs, and they're scoring the applications. But they said they're not going to announce who the winners are until like the dust settles and stuff like that. So, the point being is some states are, slowing down. Some states are just kind of continuing full speed ahead, maybe just not saying things publicly. And some are just, I won't name names, Florida and Wisconsin and Missouri.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because there were the ones that were just had abandoned it, never really even got in the race to begin with.
Yeah,
And now you have that kind of shrinking again with these blue states. So roughly, are we talking about 15, 20 states that are moving forward, or?
so let's unpack that. And I was sort of joking, but very serious when I called out those three states. So they're out of the 50 states, and just always, sometimes people say Puerto Rico and District of Columbia is not a state, right? So just for the record, I use states as the broad term that also includes two non-states, which are part of this program, which is Puerto Rico and District of Columbia. So there's actually 52 government
Potential, yeah.
entities, right? And stuff. And those two actually have issued awards and stuff. But out of the 52, there are still 9 states that haven't even issued a first round NEVI RFP. And they're not exclusively plain states, but most of them are up in that area: Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, etc. But there's also a few in the South, like South Carolina, Florida, back in the Midwest, Missouri, and stuff like that. I'm missing a couple, but so like Missouri and South Carolina sent out emails, I don't know, a week ago or a couple days ago, saying, oh, due to the executive order and the FHWA memo, we're pausing. And I've lived and breathed this for like 3 years, and it sort of made me laugh, right? Because it's like, what are you pausing? You haven't
Right.
freaking done anything. Now, that's
0% of zero is still
right.
zero.
It's a
Yeah.
bit harsh because South Carolina has done like, 20 seminars and public outreach, and they do meetings and things like that. They hired a consultant to build a website. They came up with a brand name but they actually haven't still like
Go forward, yeah.
done much on the RFP side. And so, yeah, it's unclear. I mean, with Florida, it's very clear that it was driven by politics because they said so. They came
Yeah.
out, they built a website. They literally built a website bashing EVs and the NEVI charging program, and lambasted, Biden and, the non-EV mandate, and, NEVI programs and stuff like that. And, Wyoming was always not excited about the
Which
NEVI
is
program.
unfortunate because, as we've talked about, like that's a state that could use it so badly,
They,
especially when you're
they
doing big road trips.
yeah, and like Yellowstone and stuff like that. And they had some, not great negotiation with FHWA. They asked for a bunch of exemptions to that 50-mile requirement of the program. They wanted to put them in some different areas. And actually, at some level, I think they actually were right. They were an example of where there probably should have been more flexibility. They wanted to put them out all like near Yellowstone, which sort of makes sense, but and not so much like in other
Yeah,
places where there's probably be less traffic. But yeah, so some of the states were already, you know, either intentionally for political reasons or just business reasons, lack of prioritization, not moving on this. And so this was sort of like a dream come true for them because then they could just say, all right, until somebody tells us we have to do this thing, right? We're
not
just
do
gonna
this thing.
sort of pause and
Yeah,
stuff. But yeah, and so you think about, I mean, there are 104 companies that have been awarded it one or more of these sites, right? And there's several companies that have won, like 30, 40 or more. Francis Energy is, 125, I think, and Tesla's 99, and Pilot and Loves are in the like 50, 60, 70, 80. Actually, I think is Pilot's now at like 98. I think they're right behind Tesla. Again, I used to have all these numbers memorized, but
well,
I
and
can't.
I was going to say once again that episode with Bill and Tom, they break down really good numbers and kind of have that. But you're right, it is really interesting when they show
Yeah,
the
those
top
those are my
ones.
numbers that I gave to Bill. So yeah, yeah,
There you go. But it's you're right. It's like Francis Energy and then Tesla, and then right below that, you start getting into like the traditional truck stops, really, and other
yeah,
kind of like fueling stations are obviously
yeah.
making a big move and have really started moving into this within the past year or so.
Yeah, actually,
And
I said, yeah, I did. I actually printed it out. I could have looked. 122 for Francis, 99 for Tesla, 97 for Loves, and 58 for Pilot. Yeah. But
then I
yeah,
think
and
like Quick
so
Trip and a couple others are right behind that.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Quick Trip is at 38 and one in three states. And yeah, I mean, Quick Trip is I know we're sort of bouncing around here a bit, Chase, but yeah, I mean, Quick Trip is a great example of, depending on your perspective, either it shows kind of part of the role and value and success of the NEVI program, or you might think it's, it's a poor use of taxpayer funds, right? Depending on how you think about this. But Quick Trip is a Midwestern, it's Wisconsin based convenience store chain, and they're actually like they're like part of people's family. Like it's an employee owned thing. It's like voted every year by USA Today as having the best food of any convenience store chain. Like they won this thing like several years in a row. And they're typically out in like rural Wisconsin,
yeah, kind
Iowa,
of northern,
Minnesota.
closer to the
They're
Great
starting to
Lakes.
expand into other states, and they literally are. They're not like a typical convenience store. They're literally more like supermarkets because it like the nearest, the anecdote is that the nearest Walmart is like an hour away,
Right.
right? And so they literally do their weekly shopping not at, Piggly Squiggly or Safeway or whatever it is, right? They go to Quick Trip and buy
Yeah,
their.
that's actually a really great call out because that was something I've seen on quite a few of the road trips I've done. Is like, yeah, you're right. Quick Trip, Maverick, a lot of these what you kind
Matter.
of think is
Yeah,
like
yeah,
fueling or gas station chains. I
but
remember
they're
a couple
not.
times there. No, you're totally right. Like I remember a couple times I would be because they had some superchargers along. I think it was I-80, and they were at Mavericks and a couple places like that. I remember I get in line at Mavericks and I hear the people ahead of me talking with the actual salesperson kind of behind the register.
Yeah,
And at first, I'm not really paying attention. I think they're talking about like, oh, what's the price on this, or like trying to buy something else. And then I realized they're talking about like the last night's high school football
High school
game.
football
And
game.
it's
Oh
like, and
yeah,
I was like, okay, this is a
exactly.
whole different
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
experience. And you're totally right. I mean, it's in some ways it might be a little dark that like a gas station, this kind of thing is like, and it kind of gives a whole different thing that we don't really talk about on this podcast, but like food deserts and these other things where they are these
right.
really critical kind of infrastructure for some of these more remote rural parts all over the country.
Yep,
But
yep.
I did kind of want to take a step back, just kind of given to now the point we kind of discussed where things are. There's a few other topics I'm sure we want to cover, but two things I wanted to talk with you now that we're kind of at this point was one, in our conversations, we've really talked a lot about how NEVI's evolved. And especially at the beginning, one of the themes we kind of had discussed was the fact that when you looked at the evolution and rollout of a lot of DC fast charging companies and scale, that in some ways, like NEVI was actually slowing things down because now some of these companies were kind of taking a step back and trying to get some of the federal money to help make the business case for installing in some of these locations for chargers and stuff like that. And it was really interesting how it kind of did get political, where that for a long time people were saying there were only 8 charging stations that had been built. And now, as we've kind of talked about, it really was kind of a logarithmic thing. That's once it started kicking off, yeah, for a while, there's only quite a few. And now there's hundreds, and now there's going to be more than that. But looking back now, kind of at the NEVI program, what it's been and where it's going, like how do you still feel that way? Or do you think just given the size of the industry and where it was, like that was kind of a necessary thing? And in the scheme of things, what was it? Maybe 6 months it slowed stuff back, or kind of
Yeah,
reflecting back on that, how do you how do you approach that idea of like NEVI at first was kind of slowing down the progress we're seeing and what the greater impact actually was to the EV charging community?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how much it may have actually slowed the industry down. What I saw was when NEVI first started and I launched my NEVI database and I started getting customers subscribing to it and talking to them. What a lot of them, their initial attitude was, woohoo, free money, right? Like
Yeah,
they were excited, right? We're going to get 80% of, the charging station that we're planning to put at the Quick Trip or I mean, that's not at the, the Sheets, the Wawa, like next to the hotel. Like we're gonna go build these out there and we're gonna, get, 80% of our costs taken care of, and this is going to
right.
be great. Now we just have to figure out like where to put them, to meet the 50 mile, 1 mile, all the requirements, and is there power there and all that kind of stuff. And so, again, I'm not sure how much it slowed things down, but people had to sort of look at locations and things sort of differently because they couldn't just say, like if let's say you're a Circle K or somebody like that, right? You couldn't just go, okay, here's our plan. We're going to roll them out in, California, New York, Colorado,
Yeah,
like high adopting states. You actually had to look at who's issuing an RFP and
right.
do our stores actually, are they located on the corridor within 1 mile and meet all the requirements? Is there power there? All that kind of stuff. So they had to be they had to factor in like all these different sort of elements to see if they actually had a location. If they were like a retailer or something like
Yeah,
Pilots and Love and Circle K, et cetera. If they were, if they were just a deployment company, then sort of the world was their oyster, right?
yeah.
But then they had to go out and find, a hotel or a,
Some sort of host
supermarket
and
or a shopping mall or whatever, negotiate with them, get that in place, and then do it. But to your point, what I did see was after there were several kind of states and they went through the process, what a lot of companies started to realize was, oh, I may not win.
yeah.
I have competition. They're
I
like,
do feel like it did slow down, but it was a temporary, like it was like a 6 month period. And then kind of the realization of what was required and like the
yeah,
reality of it's kind of set in. It's like people kind of just realize, okay, we'll keep going for this, but we might have to just continue doing our own thing anyway.
Well, that's exactly it. What the what the words are that I use and a lot of my customers said is NEVI sort of very quickly became a nice have, not
Yeah.
not a must have, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there was this period of maybe early on of like 6 months or something where they actually had to go through the application and awards process to see what that was like, who the competitors were, and sort of understand how much what is the what I like to say is the LOE versus the ROI. What is the level of effort
Yeah.
versus the return on investment of this? And then they actually had experience and track record of doing some of these things, and they started to realize, oh, actually we proposed a 20% match, which is the NEVI minimum requirement, but company X, who we were up against for that same corridor, actually submitted an application with a 35% match. And they've done 1,000 charging stations and put them in the ground, and we've only done 50. Um, we partnered with a supermarket, and they partnered with a convenience store chain that's open 24 hours with Wi-Fi, restrooms, better lighting, a pull-through like they
Yeah.
started to understand the competitive construct of this and what it's going to take to win. And
Well,
so then a lot of companies just like, okay, we're gonna continue applying. We're just going to be more strategic, more methodical, and we might have to like change some things, right? We might need to add NACS connectors where we weren't planning before. Some locations we might need to, include pull-through lanes like Louisiana, where it's the fisherman's capital of the
yeah.
world, and they have boats and trailers, so they, and a lot of things like that. And so it sort of pivoted, but then it sort of hit its rhythm, and you know people now kind of they then got their methodologies down. They'd done it. They basically got their template for their applications, and they knew how to do it, and it was just sort of rinse and repeat.
That's actually a really interesting point. Kind of what led to its evolution and its impact was kind of a change in strategy and essentially them kind of seeing what's actually getting implemented, going from paper and
Yep.
theory to practice. Because one of the things I've heard, and I kind of get this sentiment, but what is really interesting now is like I guess I'll say it, and that's I know some people in the industry who are kind of like, with these changes to NEVI, it's kind of unfortunate, but you started seeing a lot of people winning bids who, like you even said, maybe only had a couple or maybe didn't really have the experience to be doing this and doing this long term. And so there have been kind of, and to be honest with you, since I've kind of been following this space now for 2 decades, as crazy it seems, I don't really think this is as nearly as big of an issue with NEVI as it was for those who are listening, familiar with the West Coast Electric Highway. Those ones that are put in are just garbage.
Right.
I hate to be so blunt, but I've never had a good experience with them, and other people have verified my anecdotes and experience. But it's just interesting. That's on a whole nother scale, a whole nother level.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's interesting because we're seeing like your numbers show. It's kind of the name, like we have Tesla, and then it's like the traditional names we know are now the ones that are winning and kind of flown the top. But there was kind of some realizations by those in the industry. They're kind of like, it did let in a few people trying to get in this money that maybe didn't have maybe the experience or should be like winning or kind of being in this fight. I don't know. I'm kind of curious on your thoughts
Yeah.
about that and
So
what
yeah,
those
no,
outcomes have been.
I've heard that. I also have received comments from people on some of my LinkedIn posts when I show like who the top winners are and stuff like that, and they're like, like it's the usual suspects. It's sort of the big guys. Like, is this a really good thing? And what I explained to them is a couple things. One is um, that the reason Tesla and Francis and Loves and Pilot and some of these other companies have won so many awards is A, they've actually submitted applications in 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 states, and in some cases multiple rounds of RFPs within states. Whereas, and I'll just, use a, common sort of anecdote of, Bob's EV deployment company in Podunk, Iowa. They're only going to submit applications in Iowa,
Yeah.
probably, maybe Minnesota, right? So my point being, when you look at the numbers of it showing, there's like the, Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule of like, there's like 10 companies that have won a majority of it. It's like, well, look at who they are. Like most of them are national companies that have submitted applications in like a ton of states, and therefore the math works. They've won a lot. Secondly, they have experience. And so when each of the states are scoring them with their scoring rubrics on things like everything from amenities and cost to experience, and things like that, they typically do well, at least on the like experience side. Sometimes they don't do so well. Like sometimes Tesla, as an example, like crushes it on. They have the lowest cost, they have the most experience, but maybe they've partnered with, like a strip mall,
Yeah.
somewhere, and it's
Well,
like,
it goes back to what we're talking about, like that experience from like, sure, 8 to 5 p.m. it might be totally fine,
yeah,
but in the
and
greater
so
scheme of thing and in
yeah,
this rubric
and
especially.
the interesting thing that I've seen, so we track, and we have a table where I track and compare all the states and the RFPs across dozens and dozens of both elements of the RFP and how they score it. And site amenities is almost always the highest category in the scoring rubric, which meaning you can get the
Interesting.
most points. It's typically anywhere from 20 to 35% of the points that you can get. Whereas cost is usually third or fourth, right? And team is typically second or something like that. But so yeah, and so, but then, like, to your point, I mean, we're not going to name names, but there are certainly, there have been some companies, where maybe you scratch your head a little bit of why they've been awarded and why they won, and we'll probably never know why. But I file open records requests, and when I can get them, I get the actual scores and can see the actual applications and things like that. And so you can see what's going on. And when you have the scores, you can see um, potentially why they won. I mean, I'll give you sort of an example. Again, I'm not going to name names, but
But Bob's EV in Iowa.
no, these are two national companies. One,
Gotcha. So yeah, okay, gotcha, on the largest
yeah,
scale.
one a convenience store chain, and one a CPO, a charging network slash CPO, that both were awarded, a couple of sites in a state, um, and ended up with their total score being pretty close. But when you pulled back the leaves, right, and looked at it, one of them had a really high score on like their team and experience category, and uh, yeah, and then the other one had but and low on cost. The other one had a really high score on amenities because they were like a convenience store chain and stuff like that. And they scored high uh, on cost because I think they submitted like a 40% match or whatever it is. I may have gotten
Gotcha.
that math wrong, but the point being is, like, you sort of looked at the levers like you see on an equalizer, if
Yeah,
anybody's
yeah, yeah.
old enough to remember equalizers of your music. Um,
Now they're pretty much digital, but yeah,
right,
yeah,
right. But it's sort of like that, right? Where
yeah.
you had a company that did really well on their experience not so well on the cost, but another one did really well on their cost and really well on the amenities, and low in experience. But the scores basically added up about the same, right? And so they each won in sort of separate corridor areas and stuff like that. But so, the point being that I always tell people is there are multiple ways to win, right? Because these scoring rubrics can be 100 points, 200 points, 1,000, 2,000. Those are typically the scoring totals I've seen. So but then, so instead of one state, you might get 20 points for the experience category. In another state, it might be 200 points for that same category. But the point being is, like, you have the ability to increase your chance of winning by, moving some things around. Like, so
Well,
maybe
and it sounds like the
maybe
point
we,
is that if anyone's listening to this and they are trying to win bids, they need to reach out to you and Paren
well,
as a
that
freebie,
goes,
kind of a cheap layup to you on that.
yeah,
But
thank you, appreciate it.
I want to be respectful of your time because I realize
Yeah,
we are kind of hitting the hour mark, and
yeah,
I really appreciate all this kind of recapping, not only just what's happened the last few weeks, but a lot that's been unpacked with the
yeah,
history of it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I think before we go, I would love to just kind of quickly go over. You even shared that there was some breaking news as this saga's unrolled,
Oh,
and
yeah,
maybe just
yeah.
your thoughts of where you see NEVI going. And then we can always confirm those the next time we talk
Yeah,
soon.
yeah, yeah, and I do want to make sure that we have a few minutes just to educate your consumers on both the positives and potentially the weaknesses of the NEVI program, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that I've learned over the last year, especially probably done 100 media interviews with reporters, and most of them, there's so much they don't know, and by
Yeah,
extension, I uncover even people in the industry don't know a lot of the aspects of the NEVI program and what its role and value is. But
I'm
yeah,
still shocked at how many people think, well, why is Tesla so popular? I mean, everyone else makes hybrids.
right, right.
I still
Yeah,
hear that. I mean,
yeah,
but I
yeah,
mean, but especially even to exactly what you're talking about, the niche
yeah,
of the NEVI world and
yeah,
fast
yeah. It's
charging.
like, what do you mean it doesn't have a gas engine?
Yeah. No, totally.
But at any rate, so the sort of the breaking news is was that on Thursday, what's today? Thursday, February 13th.
We're
Um,
recording this on Valentine's Day,
yeah,
February 14th, for those listening. So just
yeah,
FYI.
yeah. So yeah, I guess I need to run out to the greeting card store after
Same
this.
here.
But that probationary employees of the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation were dismissed yesterday. Um, and so not all employees of the Joint Office. And for those people listening that may not be familiar with the Joint Office, it was basically an entity that was created sort of under IRA and the program to basically work between the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation, because really that's when we're talking about EV charging infrastructure. It's both the transportation infrastructure and it's the energy stuff, right? So it
Yeah.
kind of, and both sides know some things and not other things. So the joint office actually was, I think, actually a really good idea and made a lot of sense of like, let's bring these people together, and they're sort of the glue. But plus they took and they worked on like the NACS requirements. They're working on a lot of the technical specs, the payment stuff. They're working on cybersecurity. They're working on like trying to solve a lot of the fundamental problems that you and I and most of your listeners are aware of. Like there still are a lot of challenges in this
Yeah.
industry. But at any rate, so apparently on Thursday, again, the joint office was not shut down, but a large number of employees who were probationary, meaning they were like maybe on loan. Like there's some employees that like worked for the national NREL. I always forget it.
National
National
Renewable Energy Labs.
Renewable Energy
Yeah.
Laboratory. Yes, thank you. So some people were like had worked for them and then moved over and stuff like that. And so those people, like a lot of those people lost their jobs. And some people maybe took the buyout.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's not good news that a lot of great people are out there on the streets now, and we're doing sort of really really great things and stuff. So and that's the net effect of it is, again, it sounds like I've had this confirmed. It has not been shut down, but it looks like it's significantly depleted from a resource and expertise factor, and so that's going to further like cause issues with the states, because a lot of the states relied on the joint office for helping them with technical questions and issues and things like that. So yeah, not great news there, but yeah. And then there's still, I haven't seen any specific lawsuits yet, from whether it's states or associations or companies, like the ones we've mentioned file lawsuits. There was a number of states filed a lawsuit, restraining, I forget what it's called, RT, I'm blanking on what it's called, but last week, but that was related to the overarching Trump
Yeah.
uh, funding pause, right? And so it's not clear that how that applies specifically to NEVI, but my presumption is that some of the associations that represent state DOTs and DOEs and things like that, and different groups are probably working on lawsuits and things like that, and this will go to court. I'm almost surprised it hasn't already, but my assumption is that soon the pause will be unpaused. But you never know. But yeah, so it's craziness, it's uncertainty, it's chaos, which is ultimately is the purpose of this, right? The purpose of all of this is, yeah, we know we can't actually stop it, but we can cause pain and confusion and slow it down, and um, they're succeeding at that. And the other just sort of final point on that, Chase, is I did a media interview last week where I predicted that while whatever pause attempts happen, it's actually going to have minimal impact on the number of chargers that are going to go in the ground, right? Because as you said, is like, my prediction is that in 2025 there'll probably be around 16,000 new DC fast charging ports opened in the U.S. Now, depending on what happens with the pause and all that stuff, anywhere from maybe 1,000 to 2,000 of those could be NEVI funded. But the point being, it's like a small percentage.
Right.
Iona and Walmart and BP Pulse and Tesla and EVgo and Electrify, these companies are like
Full steam
building,
ahead. Yeah.
yeah, full steam ahead, right? And so yeah, so it's not going to have a significant impact on numbers. What it is going to have an impact is where they go, right? Which is filling out those charging
That's a good
deserts,
point.
and that's unfortunate. And the ironic thing is that if any of that is slowed down, it's going to most directly and disproportionately affect the Trump voter base, which is people out in rural areas and in the South and the northern plain states and stuff. So it's rather ironic. But yeah, so it's and the other thing that I mentioned is that, and we're already seeing this. We're seeing headlines saying, Trump has stopped the building of charging stations in the U.S.
Yeah.
No, like he hasn't
Yeah.
stopped it, right? But
We could easily do like a podcast series each an hour long about the how bad the takes and titles and
yeah,
headlines have
yeah,
been about the EV space and EV
yeah.
charging right now has been.
Yeah, and so somebody in the charging industry commented on one of my LinkedIn posts. She says, "Oh my God, this is exactly what happened. I had a call with my mother. She's in
Yeah.
the charging industry. She had a call. She goes, 'Oh, yeah, Trump killed the build out of EV charging program. Why would anybody buy an EV now? And it's like,
Yeah.
it was sort of like I was talking to the reporter, or I initially predicted that, and I was like, good news, bad news. Sort of the good news from my perspective was I was right. I predicted what would happen. The bad news is I was
Right,
right.
exactly.
You
I
know?
mean, this is a whole different thing altogether. But
Yeah.
just kind of speaking of misnomers and uh, ineffective titling of things,
Yeah.
I am very curious to see. Obviously, the thing that's kind of been in the news the last 48 hours was the Tesla armored
Right.
EV thing, and then it kind of got some news, and they renamed it, and then the other context that seems to be left out of all these stories is awarded in December under Biden.
Right. Right.
Now they've said they're not doing it either way, but when I read that, obviously a lot of journalists like, oh my God, here's something we can get on Tesla. And my first immediate reaction was like, I bet you 10 to 1, this was just some poor guy in some federal things like EV, Tesla, what, like just a line item and wrote Teslas. Cause I've seen that happen so many times, even at dealerships. Kind of going back to what I'm talking about, like Teslas are
Yeah.
hybrids, right? Or just, it's kind
Yeah.
of like referring to tablets as iPads or tissues as Kleenex. Like I've seen that
Yeah.
happen
Yeah.
so many times. We'll see
Yeah.
if it's different, but
Yeah.
it's
No.
like that kind of thing where it's just
It's I mean, it's great that you mentioned that, because it's from a political perspective, it was sort of the flip, right?
yeah,
Where and I saw a lot of like posts on Facebook from people who are like lambasting, Trump and Musk and all this kind of stuff. And when I first saw the first article, I'm, wait a minute, it's like mid-February.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah,
this was probably done several months ago, right? Like,
yeah,
and then like you said, like during the course of like, 12, 18, 24-hour news cycle, it starts to come, oh yeah, this was awarded, before. But everybody just jumped on, one side of the aisle, as we like to say, jumped on,
right,
the evilness of this. And then it turned out it was like, oh, yeah, it was awarded before, maybe. So
right.
yeah, but
I mean, maybe they did get a deal. Maybe it is going to help move Cybertruck sales or something, and maybe we're seeing Cybertrucks running around with rail guns on the back of them. But I'm
yeah,
not expecting it anytime soon. Lauren, we've talked about a lot of different topics around NEVI and just the state of EV charging, and maybe people listening, I feel like there's so much news that's kind of negative. But
yeah,
I know both of us, even though we can kind of have a gray cloud above our heads are now, overall are optimistic. And so I'm sure there's a lot that you are seeing and thinking about moving forward and just like some of the positive things that come out of NEVI, and would love to hear some of that.
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the sort of the headlines and negativity we many of us have read over the last year or so is very few chargers have been built for the $5 billion and that type of thing. Well, the reality is, right, it's actually, there's, like 58 stations that have been opened, and it's a cost of 32 million. So, first we got to get the numbers right. And the cost is actually pretty competitive to what we're seeing out there normally. But, the thing that I really want to sort of stress, that a lot of people may not understand or be aware of, is that the first and fundamental role and value of NEVI is not like getting to that infamous 500,000, sort of charging number goal that Biden set out. NEVI is a strategic program about putting them where they're not. NEVI is a program about
True.
filling out those charging deserts. We talked about, going out to, Yellowstone and, upstate New York and, rural Alabama and like out there, those stretches, we're all used to, those signs on the interstates that say, next gas 32
Right.
miles, next gas 40 miles. And that was sort of the art and science behind the every 50 miles and 1 mile from the highway, is that, people are comfortable with and understand that there needs to be sort of an option, for their bladder and everything else, and food, sort of every X number of miles. And the 50 was a pretty good thing. And so the first thing about NEVI is, again, it's not about like putting in hundreds of thousands of chargers. It's probably only going to put in, by my estimate, 8 or 9,000 fast charging ports in the first phase of NEVI, the corridor phase. But it's going to put them where Electrify America, EVgo, Tesla, etc., historically haven't been putting them, right? They're going to put them out there in those rural areas. And it's solving the chicken and the egg thing, right? Because the charging networks are not putting them out there because there isn't a lot of EV traffic, right? And EV drivers aren't driving on those highways because there aren't EV
and
chargers.
people aren't buying EVs because they're not
Right.
seeing these EV chargers. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
visibility is the second big thing that I don't think gets
Yeah.
enough recognition.
So, the first just, sort of positive point I really want to make is this is not about numbers. It's not about like speed necessarily of getting, it's about getting them in where we give consumers who are on the fence about considering an EV confidence that they can go to Yellowstone, they can go visit their grandma or Aunt Betty in, 3 states over out in the middle of rural Iowa. And
Yeah.
there's actually several charging stations that are open, working, and available, right? That's the first thing. But the second thing that doesn't get talked a lot about is that, you recall, and we've talked a lot about this, and when you had Bill Farrow on, you talked a lot about is we've gone through a period where, reliability was a massive problem and black eye for the industry. Remember, we went through this period where the headlines in the industry for like months were about, 25% of all fast chargers are not working at any given moment, right? And, the horror stories on YouTube videos and social media and stuff about just not working chargers. And while NEVI is not a rule, requirement, and law that applies to all fast chargers, it's had a like de facto, sort of sidebar effect, which is, the 4 150 kW charging ports, right? And being able to charge at a minimum of 150 for 4 cars at once, and the 97% uptime, which, many of us think is a kind of a low bar.
Yeah.
But it's the first time we've had
A
actual
bar.
accountability
Yeah,
and a
exactly.
bar. Exactly. Right. And so what's happened is, even though, the station X by, charge point operator Y is putting in a location that's not NEVI, like there's sort of an expectation that it'll be at least 150, that'll at least be 4, if not 6 or 8 or 12 chargers. And it's probably going to be 350 kW, not 150. And that it's going to work, right? Like, so I think,
I think that is a good reflection to look back. And you're totally right. It really wasn't that long ago that we were concerned you'd show up and it was, 1, even there sometimes, the right location. 2, it'll even work.
right.
And then 3, yeah,
It's like,
it's in a not halfway sketchy place or anything else.
it's a 50
Or slow,
kW
derates, stops after a few minutes of plugging it in.
Yeah. And so I think, again, it's not a law that's applied to non-NEVI, but like sort of it made all boats rise in the bay, as the old saying goes. It's sort of, there's this like expectation. And so, and then, you had a lot of people go, 4 is too few, 150 is too slow, right? It like literally made people say, well, yeah, let's do even better. And the 97%, if you do apply for NEVI and win, right, like there are actually penalties if you don't hit that. And so it's forced the industry to buy better, more reliable hardware, and have backup systems, better monitoring. Like it's
and it can also forces the automakers to now make faster charging vehicles because there is the infrastructure that can
and move
do a lot
forward
of this
more quickly on things like plug-in charge and stuff. So I think that's something that gets overlooked, is that it's really actually driven the industry to kind of one level up.
It's given a really good foundation of what needs to be there.
And just the third and final point on this is that if we go back and look at the sort of the winners list, and we talked about this, Pilots, Loves, Quick Trip, Circle K, Sheets, Wawa, they may not always be the applicant, but
That's
the
true.
the convenience store chains and
That's a good
travel
point.
centers are winning, the majority of the being the site hosts. And, you know, we've talked a lot about this, and the whole industry does, of you pull up to a charging station and it's back by the garbage cans in the back corner of a parking lot, and there's no lighting and stuff like that, and it's not a good experience. There's no bathrooms, there's no people around, there's no lighting, right? There's no amenities and stuff, and that um, this has brought in players like the convenience store
Yeah.
chains, and travel centers, and even hotels and supermarkets and people like that have these amenities to get in the game, right? And look at the things that like Walmart and Iona and Mercedes-Benz are doing. And they didn't necessarily get into the game because of NEVI, but it's certainly influenced them, and they're part of it. And so I think that's my third sort of positive point, is we can't lose sight that it's NEVI's helped attract like a better type of site host, right? And companies
Better
give,
site host, better
yeah,
experience,
better
and yeah, and
experience.
just set that kind of bar of what it needs to be to not even just be competitive, but like I said, make better vehicles
Yeah,
to use this
yeah,
infrastructure
yeah. And now
and
you
get
like you,
people want to buy EVs.
yeah, you talk to people in the industry, and it's like, everybody sort of talks about that, you know, two 50 kW chargers, out by the garbage cans in the back.
Yeah,
That's the past now, right?
right.
Like that is unacceptable, right? Like we've sort of moved from, oh, I'm just happy to find like a working charger back there, to no, I expect there to be food, restrooms, lights, you know, 250, 150, 350 kW, 6, 8, like it's just, we,
Megawatts. Let's yeah,
yeah,
go all the way.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And
yeah.
so, I think, years from now, we'll look back and go, oh, you know, NEVI was a big part of the catalyst to moving the industry from this sort of entrepreneurial, lot of problems, shortcomings, not ideal customer experience, to really sort of the next level of better companies, more well capitalized companies, better experiences, and yeah, and so I think it's
I think
the
those are
programs.
all just great points that make it seem
Yeah,
like things to be positive about and remember where
yeah,
we've come from and where we're going. And once again, to look back at the transition from steam to the
right.
and horses to the modern automobile, and kind of now this in its own generation for this century.
Yep, yep, absolutely. Yeah,
Lauren,
yeah,
I really do. I realize we have gone over time, and I really do enjoy speaking with you about this. This has been great. For anyone listening, obviously they can find out more about you, about Paren, but I believe you guys have a couple events that you'll be at as well in kind of the upcoming future
yeah.
that
I
people can
mean,
see at as well.
yeah, a lot of people in the industry. We will be at the what's known as EVCS, the EV Charging Summit, in Las Vegas in March. I think it's the 21st through the 23rd, something like that. But yeah, we'll be there. Laurent McDonald, our CEO and co-founder, along with Bill Farrow, CTO, who you've had on, and myself. And so yeah, anybody's there, look us up, and yeah, we'll talk what everything that's going on with the crazy EV charging industry. But yeah,
Well, until next time, Lauren, thank you so much. We'll have links to everything we've kind of talked about and referenced today as well for those listening. So look down there for that. But until next time, thank you so much for coming on today, Lauren.
yeah, thanks a lot. It was great as always. We covered a lot of ground.
That's a wrap for this episode of Grid Connections. Huge thanks again to Loren McDonald, Chief Analyst at Paren, for sharing his insider's look at how NEVI and other federal updates are shaping the EV charging landscape. From emerging trends in rural charging deserts to the rising influence of rideshare drivers on fast charging utilization. Today's discussion was packed with insights about where the industry is headed and how policy decisions are fueling or stalling new developments. If you found this conversation valuable, don't let it stop here. Please share this episode with at least one other person, a friend, colleague, or fellow EV enthusiast, so we can spread the word about what's really happening in the world of electric mobility. And if you're enjoying Great Connections, take a moment to leave us a positive review on our podcast page. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing top-tier guests like Loren. Until next week, this is the Great Connections podcast signing off.